Good morning, everyone. Yes, my name is Gerardo Delgado. I'm an energy attorney at Quarles and Brady, where my colleagues and I support our clients in the regulatory approval and development of clean energy projects and infrastructure improvement. It's an honor to be here today to really share the stage with prominent influencers in the energy industry. These are powerful women who have made an impact and continue to trailblaze across all sectors. So please join me in welcoming Commissioner Emeritus Sadzi Oliva. Yes, a round of applause. Commissioner Emeritus Lorraine Akiba. And Illinois Commissioner Maria Bocanegra. So good morning, commissioners. So for those who are not familiar with the term Commissioner Emeritus, that means former commissioner. Okay, so you still hold title, of course, certainly, as you should, because again, they continue to make powerful impact in our industry. So let's get acquainted quickly with our panelists today. Howdy, Sadzi. Let's see.
How about now?
Now? Now we can hear you.
Good.
So you left the commission last year, Sadzi. What have you been up to?
Well, first I want to say thank you, Gerardo, for moderating this panel, and to the Z Prime team for inviting me to participate. Yes, I'm a Commissioner Emerita, sorry. And I was a commissioner for 4 years. I was in public service for 22 years, a lawyer by training. And after all this time, I decided to go into the private sector. So I'm now Vice President of Government Relations and Community at United Scrap Metal. United Scrap Metal is a national recycling company. We service the manufacturing and energy sectors. I'm really lucky that I ended up at United Scrap Metal. It's a woman-owned business. I get to stay in the energy sector, which I love. And I get to be at a place that prioritizes culture, safety, and sustainability. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that as this panel goes on.
That's amazing. Aloha, Lorraine.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Hello from the state of Hawaii. Yes, as everybody knows, I am the former commissioner from the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission. I served my entire term of 6 years. I was a member of the NARUC Board of Directors, also the Advisory Council to the Electric Power Research Institute, so that's how I know Steve and some of the EEI folks there. During my tenure, I think I'm proud to say that Hawaii led the states in terms of 100% renewable energy portfolio standards, 100% clean energy by 2045, and 100% decarbonization by 2045. And now many states are following that. And as I mentioned in the remarks of the last session, Hawaii is a very important center for many things. Currently, there is life, as Sadzi has revealed. There is life after being a commissioner, and I decided, even though I'm also a lawyer by training, that I was not going to go back to the law firm practice, but I was going to do my own consultancy. So I'm now a CEO of my own firm, a consultancy firm. I am a senior policy advisor on both regulatory and energy policy to international and national clients, and also on corporate ESG metrics, which, as we know, is very important, and especially on the issue we're going to talk about today in terms of driving change and transformation and keeping not only the utilities accountable, but stakeholders in the process accountable. So looking forward to the conversation today.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, a joy for you and Sadzi to reflect on your regulatory past and all the great things that you're doing now in your professions. Good morning, Commissioner Bocanegra.
Good morning.
You're an ETS first-timer.
I am an ETS first-timer.
Isn't this an awesome forum?
Great. Yeah, I'm so lucky to be here. Thank you all for inviting me. I'll just get right to it. Illinois has been extremely busy. For those of you that have been following us, we are trying to live up to Hawaii's incredible work that they've been doing, but we just enacted some really amazing, groundbreaking legislation back in September of 2021. Our commission is super busy implementing a lot of that, and
yes,
I'm excited to share a lot more about that. What I will say, and I was thinking about what to share with you guys about that, I thought, really it's the legislation that kind of drives a lot of what we're going to be talking about. But I think I'm wrong. I think really it's the regulation, because that really is the final step. That really is where this stuff gets implemented. That's where we really put the meat and potatoes together. So I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit more about that.
That's great. It's about the implementation. All right, so let's get started. So we're here to identify ways in which regulators and policymakers can enable a diverse and community-centric industry, right? But let's define that. Let's quickly do so. So what does it mean? What does a diverse and community-enabling industry mean? Any thoughts, Lorraine?
Yeah, I think it's obviously reflective of where you are locally. So you may think locally, act globally, but it is reflecting not only the communities that a utility or regulators are working in that ecosystem, but representation of all sectors within that community. So low, moderate income. I mean, that's historically been in utility regulation. We have programs directed to giving financial assistance, payment options, educational outreach for low, moderate income customers. But really, it's more than that in terms of inclusiveness, and especially as we try to develop our communities. Utilities are major employers, and they can provide opportunities for workforce development, for jobs, for empowerment of the community by not only hiring workforce, but providing training opportunities with state and local governments so that young people can see a career in STEM, and this is a growing area. I mean, ETS just tells you. I mean, technology, the future, high-skilled, high-wage jobs are in the energy sector. So there's a big responsibility there.
That's exactly right. So, Sadzi, how important it is to define terms, right? As we're building, as we're kind of planning, how important it is to define these terms, just like we did so.
Well, I think what matters the most is that we achieve the best results. So whatever it is that your organization wants to call it, the important thing is that you achieve the best results possible in diversity, equity, and inclusion.
That's great. So, Commissioner Bocanegra, we participated in a forum for the water companies recently. We talked about the need to kind of define terms across all sectors. How important is that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think looking back to the water affordability thing that we partnered on, I think it varies. I think Lorraine brought up a good point. I think part of it is geographically based, but also I think, you're seeing with some of the new federal legislation, a lot of the state legislation, it really is also agency based, and there needs to be some sort of consistency amongst that. And to Gerardo's point, when we were doing this water affordability workshop, what we realized was that our agencies or commission's approach to the concept of affordability was very different than, let's say, DHS or, EPA. And so there does need to be some sort of standardization or at least some baseline framework with which to work in. But, ultimately, I think the other thing I would add is that this really has to capture equity and access. Ultimately, I think that is sort of the new requirement, I think, across all of our sectors.
Okay, so great. So I think we've provided kind of a foundation where to kind of pivot, right? So let's dive in. Let's talk about the methods in which we can create a diverse industry. And one of those methods is through workforce, right? And in developing that diverse workforce, I think is a good conversation to kind of kick this off is through supplier diversity. So Sadzi, what does it mean to implement supplier diversity initiatives?
So back when I was a commissioner, I served as NARUC's chair on the Regulatory and Industry Diversity Committee. So I learned a lot about this, and it actually became my passion during my term as a commissioner. It means mentoring diverse suppliers. It means reducing barriers to their entry into the energy space. And it means developing them. So it isn't enough to say, okay, you're in our pipeline of diverse suppliers, great, but it's also showing them how to grow even more so that they go from being a local business to a national business.
So when we're talking about suppliers, right, we're talking about these third parties. And I think often, the focus happens to be on utilities, right, what they're doing. But clearly the industry is vast. There are other participants and players in this field, so there should also be some kind of participation and awareness of as to what they're doing to develop supplier diversity and within their channels. Commissioner Bocanegra, how have you seen supplier diversity playing out in Illinois and also across the country?
Yeah, well, I'll start by echoing Sadzi's previous comments. I think Illinois is a real leader in this space. As you know, we were one of the first, if not the first state to mandate supplier reporting from our regulated entities. Now let's take that a step further. I mentioned, we just enacted a lot of this clean energy legislation back in September. And I'll go back to saying what I've shared across a bunch of forums, and that is really the bedrock of this legislation is equity and access. And I think what you see in this tranche, if you will, of new mandated reporting requirements is that more than ever, there's a lot of DEI required across some of our sister agencies, some of the grant funding that they're giving out, where these applicants are from. A lot of our performance-based rate-making metrics also include supplier diversity, mandated reporting requirements, and the scope of our existing legislation now also includes solar developers, wind developers. And so I think we're seeing sort of the next iteration of what that expectation looks like. And that's not to say that regulated utilities don't already undertake it, but if we're talking about what opportunities and incentives there are, I think from a regulator's perspective, sometimes frameworks like this are necessary in order to sort of encourage and lift off some of these greater goals.
So let's put a pin on what you just said regarding what they're already doing, because many institutions are already kind of acting or putting these practices into play, right? But quickly, if you can just share with the audience, what are some of the metrics that your utilities and the other participants that you regulate are reporting on?
Yeah, so some of the current existing metrics with respect to DEI and supplier diversity, we're asking everything from, what is the makeup of your corporate boards? What is the percentage of hires for women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses? What percentage or contract share? What's the dollar spend? Some of our utilities have gone so far as to develop, and I think rightfully so, what that translates in terms of economic dollars at the local level, what the impact of that investment looks like. And as I said, some of our more increased reporting requirements now centers on Tier 2, Tier 3 suppliers, as well as demonstrating that their RFPs are as diverse and inclusive as possible.
So again, another indication where metrics and numbers are important, right? It's how to scale and measure things. And I will also add, at the end of your tenure, Sadzi, I recall too that we were starting to ask, and I guess the caveat here is I used to serve as an advisor to Sadzi Oliva. You started asking the utilities and those regulated entities also about supplier diversity spend within the LGBTQ certified businesses, which again wasn't mandated by regulation, right? But nonetheless, again, forward thinking of the need to diversify this industry. So, Lorraine, Commissioner Bocanegra pointed something out, practices that people are doing and perhaps maybe not doing, which begs the question, who should be leading this? Should this be a mandate? Should, this reporting be required of our entities, or should it be voluntary?
Yeah. So do we use the carrot or do we use the stick?
Yeah, exactly.
I think that I think regulation is important. I'm glad to see voluntarily there are many private companies and utilities that have stepped up, but oftentimes inertia sets in. So I'm a firm believer that there is need for regulation. That's why we have the regulators paying attention, and even Hawaii is another state that has performance-based regulations where there are, key performance indicators. Utilities are measured and they must report out not only on the DEI, but in terms of affordability, representing low, moderate income communities. We now have at the federal level, at the Department of Energy, an Office of Environmental, or Energy Equity, keeping track of this. In fact, a former professor from Hawaii, Shalonda Baker, is the deputy director of that office. So I think it is important for regulators to monitor and keep track, but ultimately, really, it is about the private companies and utilities stepping up, and there are consequences because now we have corporate ESG, which is, I do a lot of work in that area. Impact investors, activist investors, customers are very much prosumers, and if you are not meeting the expectations in those areas, and whether it's financing companies, banks are paying attention to whether you're doing these things and you're reporting out on the social. Is there a diversity? Are you representing communities of color? People will be aware of that. And social media is a very, very powerful tool now. So while there is need for regulation and there is a need for disclosure, and people are required to do certain things, even under the SEC rules, if you're publicly traded, the most important, I think, tool is that of public opinion. And with social media, that can go like wildfire. I mean, we've seen that most recently with even Facebook and, pushback on a lot of things that come back when people are not happy that you are not living up to the standards that the community standards.
Yeah, no, it's getting that message across, right? And showing the valuation of those kind of principles and the need for diversity, right? And I think in addition to, we talked about two kind of implementation options, right? Through a mandate, through reporting numbers, and also you also hit on performance rate making, kind of introducing those qualities too when the utilities and other participants go before the commission. But we talked about these third-party channels, right? These avenues to develop diversity in the workforce. Let's talk about inside the institutions, right? And not only the companies, but also organizations, because there's also consumer advocate organizations out there. There's prominent influencers too that also have to be responsible in developing a diverse industry. So, Sadzi, what do you think? What are the methods in which, again, we could grow diversity within an institution? I know you started to highlight those in your previous remarks.
So within our own organization now at United Scrap Metal, we mentor diverse team members who show an interest in leadership or have aspirations to a different career, and they have an opportunity to build upon that career within United Scrap Metal. We have United in Leadership program that's a mentoring program, and it helps our team members achieve the aspirations that they have. We also do this internally by having a diverse executive team. I am the first Latina to serve on United Scrap Metal's executive team. Our CEO is a woman. She founded the company 44 years ago when there probably weren't many women picking up metal scrap from big manufacturing and energy sector facilities. So this is important to us as a culture. It comes from our leadership, and internally, that's how we do it.
So, Commissioner Bocanegra, let me ask you. So you hear that there are companies doing this internally, right? And you're from a state that mandates it. But should the regulator, and we'll hold you to this, in future conversations, but, who should be mandating this as far as developing inside? I mean, should it be, you and your colleagues, or should it be the legislature? Like, who needs to kind of require this?
Yes.
Yes. All the above.
All of the above. I think it sounds cliche, but it does take a village. And, I think that there are benefits to encouraging it by way of legislation or regulation. But I think beyond that, I'm listening to us chat here, and what's going through my mind is that, and I say this a lot, and that is we often expect a lot of our utilities. That their role is changing, the way that they interact with consumers is changing, the way they interact with their communities. We're asking them to be workforce development folks. We're asking them to lift up marginalized communities, et cetera. I think the only thing I will add to that comment is simply that, I think that also should come from us as well, as regulators, as commissions, as agencies. I think it's incumbent upon us to ensure that those metrics are being achieved, but more importantly, that through our processes, that there is diversity of representation. And I'll give you an example. Through some of our new legislation, we have mandated that we hear from a diverse group of community stakeholders for everything from our EV workshops to our battery energy storage workshops we have a low income rate study. That is something I think that has largely been left out. I think all too often we've relied on the traditional stakeholders that we see, the consumer advocates, the attorneys generals, and those are important voices, but we very rarely hear from some of the smaller communities. And so I just want to kind of highlight that in terms of diversity. I think it's also participatory access to the process itself.
Yeah, and I think that's a good preview to what we're going to continue of all the conversation is that community enabling industry, right, and the way in which voices can be heard. You talked about really accountability through regulation, right? The commission has broad authority, right, and I think that commissions can act without necessarily, or at least that's what I'm hearing is that commissions can act without, let's say, a directive from a legislator. So let me hear from quickly too from Lorraine and Sadzi on this, right? As former regulators, do you have authority? What is your accountability as regulators to kind of move the needle?
Yeah, I think as regulators, we do have that authority. I mean, it is a broad authority, but let's say, for example, I'm going to take a concrete example, like when a utility wants to come for approval of, a power purchase agreement, which involves a third party. Oftentimes, they're going to have to demonstrate, based on past precedent, community outreach, community education, going out in the community. And in fact, in our jurisdiction, Hawaiian Electric requires the developer to demonstrate that they have not just a one-off, but they have regularly met with the community, educated the community, heard from the community, taken that input, and reflected that in the application that is then before the commission. And, these questions get asked, and in fact, it's filed as part of the docket proceeding. So there's demonstration of when these meetings occurred, who came, what questions were asked, were there issues that were addressed, and did the parties, address those issues? So there's an accountability there, and that becomes part of the DNA of working in the community, not to mention specific community benefits for that community, even when it's citing transmission, distribution, expanding an existing plant. I mean, I don't know if people just saw recently in the utility dive, the Arizona Public Utilities Commission denied the application to expand a gas plant that was in a community of color, and the community members were shocked that that their voices were listened to and heard. And so this is important to send a message that the utility had to go back to the drawing board to really address the impacts of what they were proposing on that community.
So clearly, again, I think we hear that there's a significant influence for the utility companies and other large corporations to really kind of diversify this industry, right? And then all the channels that they touch, whether it's internally, whether it's the community, which is through other businesses they partner with. But with that in mind, let's talk about corporate boards, right? So according to McKinsey research done in 2020, companies with higher ethnic and cultural diversity outperformed others by 36% in profitability. That's pretty significant, right? And I know there's been a lot of movement towards that diversifying corporate boards. I think specifically, I had a statistic where, it forgives me what jurisdiction, where 50% of its directors on its boards were women. So again, as prominent influencers, as powerful women yourselves in this industry, how important it is for these corporate boards to be diversified. Sadzi?
Well, I spoke about that a little bit before my previous answer. It's so important. The majority of our workforce at United Scrap Metal is diverse. So to see me in the executive team is very important. The communities that we operate in are very diverse. So it's important to have women, minorities serving in leadership positions because we all come from different walks of life and we've all had different experiences, and we bring those into our decision making and also engagement with our team members and engagement with our communities. I walk into work and I hear people speaking Spanish, and I love it. I didn't speak English when I started school. I am first generation Cuban American, so Spanish is my first language. So I love it. I absolutely love it, and I think it's really important.
So it helps to connect, right, to with whatever customer base you have, is to have these perspectives, these experiences that, again, allow when these important decisions being made, especially at the corporate level, to have those voices present. Lorraine?
I think it's really important that what you pointed out, Gerardo, is that bottom line, when you have a diverse leadership group, and in fact, women-led companies where the women are CEOs, bottom line, I mean, it's, what do the shareholders care about? Profit, revenue, accountability, a company well-run. It's in the research that women-led businesses and where you have a diverse board that reflects the community, those are much more productive companies, and they return profits to their shareholders. So it's not just, because this is a nice thing to do. Bottom line, it makes a difference. And I think the legislation you were trying to refer to is California. California now mandates that its boards have, 50% women in diversity. So, and from the LGBT community. So, the legislatures there have spoken, and the companies are responding. And regardless of whether you have legislation or not, as I said, corporate ESG, the TCFD, UN SDG, all these standards now require companies to report out what are you really doing on the S part of the environmental, social, and governance, metrics. So hard not to be transparent.
Well, it's interesting because I think also it's important to be said that I think these mandates or these actions by the legislature or by regulators, it doesn't mean that these companies are not doing this already, right? Because I think we would be probably further behind if they hadn't, if these practices haven't been already put in place. But it's just a way to create awareness and also have the discussion on how to again move the needle. So let me turn the table around with regulators, since all of you are regulators, but I'll kick it off with you, Commissioner Bocanegra. What do commissions need to do in order to build a diverse industry? How diverse is the ICC?
Well, I like to think, and I'm pretty sure I'm correct, that the ICC is and continues to be one of the most diverse agencies compared to all of our sister agencies. I do know that Sadzi was the first Latina to serve. I'm the second. We've had our first Latina general counsel there, our first African-American executive director, and it goes on, and I've sort of, obviously I've been intentional about trying to bring that same diversity to my staff for my office. I think it's important. I think, you asked a couple of questions ago, should commissions, should regulators be doing that? And I will add to all of what we've said here today, you're a public servant. It's your duty. It is your duty to do as much as you can with that public office for the greater good and in the public interest. And I think that if you're in a jurisdiction, or more importantly, in a time where this is expected, I think it's an opportunity for all of us to convene and examine ways in which we make our agencies diverse, we make corporate boards diverse, reporting or not. But I will also say, to Sadzi's point, even a step before that, it really means being intentional about creating that pipeline and really wanting to create that sponsorship and that mentorship opportunity. And so sometimes I feel like that's really where some of the gap is identifying this consistent pipeline of diverse lawyers or engineers or whatever the case may be.
We need to have a panel just on that discussion, because that definitely is one that deserves more awareness, right? Because I think it's discussed and it's mentioned many times about sponsorship and mentorship, but how is it really happening, and is it really effective? Because again, we continue to have a workforce gap. So how is that going to be solved overnight? Perspectives from you, Lorraine and Sadzi, particularly, so diversity, right? We talked about, Sadzi, you're the first Latina at the ICC, right? And just people of color general and other diversity, but perspectives as well, right? And what that brings. Because, I guess from experience, Sadzi, you picked me out from the private sector. I had no government background. So, what value does that also provide is in that, decision-making in that environment of developing diversity that again, commissions can do to implement to make sure, it's representative of the future, of the representative of their ratepayers. Any thoughts on that?
No, I think it's really, really important to have that leadership example. I remember you were going to ask a question about commissions and the need for diversity on commissions. And the reason for that is because we have to lead by example. Like Commissioner Bocanegra said, the Illinois Commerce Commission has historically been very diverse. So what did that leadership result in? Well, thankfully in Illinois, we also had very diverse leaders of utilities. And that then led to making this diversity, equity, and inclusion a priority in their utilities, which then led to the supplier diverse pipeline, which led to billions year after year being spent on diverse suppliers and developing them. So I also wanted to point out, and I don't want to forget this, that we heard from Calvin yesterday from Exelon, and he described everything they're doing to give back to the community, to make sure that everyone has access to this clean energy transition, and of course to the development of their diverse workforce. So Illinois mandated utilities to report on their diverse spend. But Exelon took that further and required that of all of their utility footprint. Same thing with Duke, same thing with Southern. So this just grows more and more the more commissioners and leaders ask the questions and pay attention to it.
And I also hear a little too, like practice what you preach, right? And I think Illinois has been a great example in kind of holistically developing a diverse industry. But is that across the board? Because is that picture really represented in the industry when you look at it holistically, Lorraine? Like,
yeah, I think women, let's not be, I guess we still need to, much work needs to be done. There's a lot of women that are leading in energy. I mean, Hawaii is one of those examples, just like Illinois. Connie Lau, who recently retired, was one of the first few women that led the Hawaiian Electric Industries, the parent corporation of Hawaiian Electric. Currently, now the new CEO of Hawaiian Electric itself, the utility, is Shelley Kimura. Many of you probably know her. She used to come to some of these meetings and to some of the thought leadership activities. They have a diverse board reflective of the community, not only women, but members of the community. But it is important for utilities to reflect the diversity in their communities, and hence to promote from within and to extend work opportunities, career opportunities from rank and file and people that work their way up. I mean, look at the SMUD board. I mean, Paul's here and, folks from their board are here. It reflects the diversity of the community, that they have customers and that that ecosystem that they are in. I think that's really essential. We could do more. And each one of the tools in the toolkit we've talked about today will help that. And I think, it's good that the current administration at the federal level is supporting that as well with job training partnership programs, with assistance, in various agencies, whether that's a Department of Labor or Department of Energy, and partnering in, other partnering agencies like DOD, that's just a large customer where you see a lot more diversity even within, military security agencies. So it is everybody, as Commissioner Bocanegra said, takes a village to raise a child. So everybody has a important role to play, but we could do a lot more. There are women CEOs. I mean, I can think about, Arizona Public Service, Portland General Electric, National Grid for a while. We've seen on the boards. I mean, Colette Honorable, who was president of the NARUC, is now on the Southern board. So, as people make their way through their careers, they have to continue to be vigilant and remind it's not just a quota, a checkoff, but it's truly integrating this into the culture and the DNA of our companies, whether they're third-party suppliers or utilities that are investor-owned utilities that are regulated, or municipal and utilities or co-ops. This has to be part of the culture, part of what we value for our community.
Yeah, for speaking of community, I will mention quickly before we move on. I mentioned earlier the power of companies, right? The private sector in developing diversity. But again, you touched on this, Lorraine, regarding the administrations, right? Governors who are appointing commissioners, and other, agency heads on their influence and ability to also create a diverse industry. Any quick thoughts on that, Sadzi, on the way in which we can create more diversity, especially among commissioners?
So I think NARUC does a really good job of educating the sitting commissioners now on the importance of having diversity on commissions, diversity within our regulated investor-owned utilities and stakeholders all around. And I think the commissioners then can do a great job by taking that back to the administrations that they were appointed by. Some states are doing a great job. Illinois, California, it's a priority. They have diverse leaderships of all state agencies. Some states could do a little better. So it's just education, awareness, what the benefits are. I think that's how you get it done.
And like conferences like ETS who create that awareness, right? So let's move on to more solutions and the ways in which regulators and policymakers can create a community-enabled industry, maybe consumer-centric, consumer-engaged population. So Commissioner Bocanegra, why is it important to engage communities in the development of the clean energy economy?
I think for Illinois, the answer is pretty simple, and that is that our the way in which we deliver and demand our energy is changing, and fortunately, but also unfortunately, it's resulted in some of our communities being left behind. I think one initiative that comes to my mind, when we passed this legislation last fall, was the coal to solar programs and tariffs. We have communities in downstate Illinois, and unfortunately, our rural communities often get forgotten about. I think everybody thinks of Chicago, and that's pretty much it. But the reality is that these are communities that are entirely dependent on some of these coal generation facilities and even some of the coal mines that are obviously now closed. And so, we've been very intentional, both as our legislators have and now in turn our agency, about ensuring that transition is meaningful for those same communities. So it's not just the diversity, it's not just the equity piece, it really is the inclusion piece that I think our next iteration of energy legislation is really focused on. And so I think to answer your question, I think obviously it's very important, but the focus needs to be on holistic community changing.
No, and I think too, like it's also highlighted in the last panel about planning, right? And as we look at where the development is happening, make sure that it's inclusive of all these communities, and there may be some barriers, whether through infrastructure or communication or just level of interest. But again, I guess all decision makers like yourselves have a responsibility to at least offer the opportunity, right? So Commissioner Bocanegra, you mentioned that Illinois right now has implemented their second iteration of clean energy policy, and it's really loaded with expectations on how to enable this community-centric participation in the clean energy economy. What are some of those tools in the legislation?
Yeah, so, I mentioned the coal to solar program. A lot of our workshop processes, again, there's a lot of mandated requirements to include community-based organizations that are more Illinois-centric, other than just a very broad, like I said, consumer advocate, et cetera. We've also made it easier for community-based organizations to file everything from comments or actually participate in docketed proceedings themselves. We've gone so far as to host workshop processes that are in the evenings, recorded, able to be watched again. That comes to my mind. We have various advisory councils that have been created that also, again, require a broad swath of representation too. And I mean, the list goes on and on. I think the other thing too is, and obviously this is a regulated industry, we do our best to sort of mimic the market, if you will. And I think one thing that we've done is try to create market mechanisms and market incentives that sort of trickle down, if you will, to some of these community-based objectives. And to give you one example, because one of my favorite topics is electrification, But some of our EV programs that we're asking our utilities to consider, there is a percentage requirement in some of our environmental justice communities, our eligible communities, and so on and so forth. I think the other requirement also is market incentives that are addressed to speak to more rural areas where there may not be incentives to invest, for example, charging stations in some of these areas. And so there is a variety or suite of options for utilities to undertake to make those investments or to partner with the private sector and usher that change into.
So, Sadzi, let me ask you to reflect again through your career as a commissioner, right? We understand there's a great dedication now in clean energy, the deployment of renewables, the deployment and the adoption of electric vehicles. That requires significant investment in infrastructure, which that in itself is a discussion, right? But how do you prioritize everything, right? Because you're calling and asking these companies and these players to say, okay, you need to improve our grid system. You need to develop, clean energy. Let's bring RNG online. Let's discover this. Let's learn about this. And then within all that, within that scheme, right? Within all those requirements, how do you prioritize this community element? And does it need to look like where it's just a list? Is it all together? I mean, what are your thoughts?
I think it's important to prioritize community, because if you don't do that, you risk not making a positive impact in the communities that you serve. So it has to be a priority as much as building new infrastructure, transitioning, from our existing energy to a clean energy economy. It's a priority. It has to be on the top of your list, because otherwise you're going to miss out on doing so much good and really listening to your customer preferences and what they need, because those are going to be different throughout your footprint.
So, Lorraine, maybe within the last few minutes we could discuss this. What do utilities, what do ancillary service providers, what does the commission risk by not seeking customer engagement of all the participants in the industry, as well as any other thoughts on the diversity component as well?
Yeah, I think there's a significant risk in terms of getting pushed back, of having negative feedback, of losing social capital when you don't engage the community, when people are either not informed, or sometimes they're misinformed and they develop a perception of what you're trying to do. You can waste so much time and money, which ends up in litigation, which nobody likes. Maybe having been a lawyer, maybe the lawyers like the litigation, but it's just not a good investment of time or effort or energy. And so community engagement not only is important for project approval, but it's also important to make sure that what you're doing reflects the needs of the community. Because then if it doesn't, and you go down through that process in a contested case docket, you'll end up not getting to where you want to go, as a utility. So it's a practical reason, but along the way, when you engage in the community, when you build trust, when you build credibility, you build those relationships that can help you really to achieve the DEI goals and metrics that you're being measured on in other places, that you'll be engaging with the community, that you'll be interfacing with the community-based organizations that could provide you workforce candidates, interns, et cetera, for some of your programs. And you don't have to be, hunting around in the community, but you'll establish those relationships up front. So all that social capital, that social equity is valuable. It translates to value. I think most boards that get it see the value of that social capital investment that is made in terms of a community.
No, very important points. So, Sadzi, what are examples in which, some players that are just getting it right? Not to say this is an exclusive list, but again, ways in which, it can serve as an example.
So a good example on the supplier diversity initiatives with our regulated investor-owned utilities is requiring their own suppliers to have their own Tier 2 program. So having a supplier like United Scrap Metal, we're a diverse supplier. We report to our utilities our own diverse spend. So that continues on the good path of economic development and opportunity. So I think that's a good example of, starting from one requirement and going all the way down the pipeline, and how good that can be all around. It's a win-win.
So I think we've heard today that, the method to create this diverse and community enabling industry is really to evaluate and study what good practices are happening across the country, right? And the forums of which you do it, whether you look at a commission or you look at organizations like NARUG, like was highlighted, and really kind of see how this is being played and how you can implement it within your own institution, with your own organizations and companies, right? But also think creatively, right? Think outside the box. Don't do necessarily everything, same thing that everyone else is doing, right? I think this forum has been a great example of kind of creating awareness in a way that which is not typically done in the energy industry. It's about thinking creative, thinking big idea. So within the last few seconds that we have I think I said that earlier, that's a few minutes, but Commissioner Bocanegra, what is one project, what is one policy change that you're looking forward to, I guess it would be twofold, that you are looking forward to seeing being implemented by you and your colleagues, or one that needs to happen? And the same question for the rest of the panelists.
Yeah, I'll be quick, but I think this is a little bit broader, but what I will say, there's not any one particular initiative or program. What I think is going to be interesting to see just generally is how we are asking our utilities to place a value on community inclusion, and really seeing, obviously a lot of this is very data driven, the things that we ask our utilities to do, whether it's load forecasting, capacity planning, et cetera, where charging stations should go. It's an entirely different thing to overlay that with now, determine the value for affordability. Or how do we ensure that there's more inclusion than ever, or that these communities are being lifted up, or what does that 40% really translate into if it's a direct or indirect benefit? So I'm most looking forward to that. I really think that is really the changing paradigm and lens in which we will probably be regulating our utilities for years to come.
Sadzi, Lorraine, any quick thoughts?
Sure. So we all think about, hear about, dream about a clean energy transition and the build out of that transition, infrastructure improvements, decommissionings. But what we don't think about, that I hope the audience members and our policymakers think about, is what happens to the waste. What happens to what's left over from those decommissionings? And that's where companies like United Scrap Metal come in, and we hope that you think about partnering with companies like us that have really good sustainability processes, that that the waste that's generated from there isn't going to end up with a bad actor in the global space, that isn't going to end up in a landfill, and that isn't going to create unsafe conditions if it happens to be attached to hazardous materials. So it's really important that you also think about what happens to what's left over during the transition, and that there are companies like us that will do it safely with really great best practices, and of course with an incredible culture, and we're a woman-owned business. So these are all things that I hope that you keep in mind, because nobody likes to talk about waste.
Lorraine, we're over. Any few thoughts?
Yeah, for me, I think the most important thing right now, we're in a digital economy, and we're going into a virtual economy, the new clean, new energy economy, and I think it's all about the people. So I think it's really important, and we've the last few days we've had sessions on this, addressing the digital divide, whether you're in electric sector, energy sector, telecom, what have you. It's making sure that our future generation of workers and leaders have the skill sets, and that's STEM skill sets. And it really is some of the stakeholders in the room here, whether you're suppliers or utilities or developers, you have the opportunity to provide those workforce training opportunities and support educational programs in your communities that help train our leaders of the future, because it's all about the next generation. And we need to fulfill that social responsibility too, as we're talking about AI and, drones and robotics and all this high-tech stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I have to share this one perspective as well. I think the industry is committed to creating this diverse and community-enabling industry. Leaving the commission and going back into the private sector through my clients, through the engagement I had in the industry locally and nationally, people are committed. So I guess I asked regulators to also be patient and also look at the progress that we've made and continue to make in the private sector because it's a passion, it's a value, and we're living it. So please join me in thanking our panelists today for their insight. Thank you. And I will turn it over to Ricky.
Thank you.